Amara Johnson sat on the curb outside the DeLuca estate every afternoon, her small basket of handmade trinkets resting between her feet. At 8 years old, with her curly puff ponytails and faded teal hoodie, she was a ghost to the men in tailored suits, just another neighborhood kid lost in the city's noise. Nobody knew she had a gift for patterns, or that she could read the jagged intent in a man's voice. Since her father's shop was taken, it was just Amara and her mother, barely keeping the lights on in their small apartment. So Amara sold her trinkets and watched. She had seen the estate's owner, Lorenzo DeLuca, several times, a tall, sharp Korean man who moved like a blade and looked through people like her as if they were made of glass. His security team was always whispering, thinking their hushed, coded calls went unnoticed. But Amara noticed. And at 5:44 p.m. on a sweltering Thursday, she overheard a secret call that made her heart hammer against her ribs. When he opens the door, the voice hissed into a hidden phone. She looked at the luxury sedan idling at the gate, looked at the guard's cold, knowing smirks, and knew that in mere minutes, a life was going to end. 5:44 p.m., 16 minutes before the end. Lorenzo DeLuca stood in his study, a sharp-looking figure in a dark tailored suit, snapping his briefcase shut with clinical precision. At 38, he had built a fortress of power through calculated risks and a total ban on sentiment. To him, trust was a vulnerability he had long since purged from his life. His phone buzzed. "Car is waiting at the gate, sir," his driver reported. Lorenzo checked his watch. 5:45 p.m. He lived by the clock. Predictability meant he was the one in control. Every day was the same. Leave at 5:58, enter the car at 6:00, be clear of the city by 6:20. No deviations. His lead guard appeared in the doorway, nodding that the perimeter was secure. Lorenzo didn't offer a thank you. He had no patience for pleasantries or anything that didn't serve efficiency. Outside, the world operated at a different, hungrier frequency. Amara held a beaded bracelet up to a woman entering a taxi. "Only $2, ma'am." The woman didn't even look her way. Amara had been out there since school let out and her basket was still nearly full. Her stomach growled and the heat of the pavement seeped through her thin sneakers. She was used to being invisible, but being invisible meant people were careless with their secrets. Like the guard now, standing just feet away, tucked into the shadow of the gate. Most would hear the low murmur of his phone call and ignore it, but Amara heard the shift in his tone, the lethal edge in his words. "Ready for 6 o'clock. The device is set. When he opens the door, it's over." The guard chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. Amara's blood went ice cold as she stared at the sleek black car Lorenzo entered every single day at 6:00 p.m. sharp. Her hands began to shake. They were going to kill him, and she was the only one in the world who knew the truth. Amara Johnson adjusted the straps of her teal hoodie. The fabric faded from too many washes but still warm against the rising humidity of the afternoon. She sat on a low concrete ledge just outside the towering wrought iron gates of the DeLuca estate, her small wicker basket perched on her knees. Inside were a dozen beaded bracelets and small hand-painted trinkets, the result of late nights spent working while her mother slept off the exhaustion of double shifts. To the men in dark suits and the wealthy residents of the district, Amara was merely a fixture of the sidewalk, as unremarkable as the fire hydrants or the cracks in the pavement. She was 9 years old, small for her age, and possessed the unique power of the truly overlooked. She was invisible. Being invisible had its advantages. People didn't watch their tongues around a child they didn't think could understand them. Amara had learned to be a silent observer, watching the ebb and flow of power from the curb. She knew which guards were lazy, which ones were cruel, and she knew that the man who owned the estate, Lorenzo DeLuca, was a man of absolute, unbreakable routine. He was a sharp, handsome man who looked through her as if she were made of glass, but Amara didn't mind the coldness. She just needed to sell enough bracelets to help her mother with the electric bill that always seemed to be overdue. At 5:44 p.m. the air felt heavy, charged with a tension only Amara seemed to notice. A few feet away, one of the newer security guards, a man Lorenzo seemed to trust, stepped into the shadow of a stone pillar. He pulled a burner phone from his jacket, his eyes darting toward the estate's front doors. He didn't see Amara sitting just behind the hedge, her hands frozen over her basket. "The package is set," the guard whispered into the phone, his voice a jagged rasp of excitement. "Under the driver's seat. Remote detonation." Amara's heart gave a violent thud against her ribs. She stopped breathing, her wide eyes fixed on the guard's polished shoes. "When he opens the door at 6 o'clock, it's over. He won't even have time to scream." The guard let out a low, chilling chuckle and snapped the phone shut. Amara's blood went ice cold. She looked at the sleek luxury car idling at the curb, the very vehicle Lorenzo De Luca would step into in exactly 16 minutes. Her hands began to shake so hard that a beaded bracelet slid from her fingers and clattered onto the concrete. She wasn't just a girl in a teal hoodie anymore. She was the only person in the world who knew that a man was about to walk into a death trap. Inside the cool, marble-lined sanctuary of the De Luca estate, the world operated with the silence of a well-oiled machine. Lorenzo De Luca stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal-gray suit. At 38, he was a man who had mastered the art of the clinical gaze. To Lorenzo, the city outside was a series of equations, and people were merely variables to be managed. He did not believe in luck, he believed in precision. His morning had followed the same rigid architecture for a decade: 4 a.m. workout, 5 a.m. briefings, and a sharp departure at 6 o'clock. To deviate from the schedule was to admit a lapse in control, and Lorenzo De Luca controlled everything. He snapped his leather briefcase shut, the sound echoing like a pistol shot in the quiet room. On his mahogany desk, 3 phones sat in a perfect row. He ignored the one reserved for personal matters. It rarely rang anyway. Sentiment was a luxury for those who didn't have an empire to defend. He viewed his own life as a fortress, built brick by brick with cold logic and a total lack of emotional interference. He prided himself on his ability to see through people, to anticipate a rival's move 3 steps ahead, yet he was utterly blind to the rot festering within his own walls. His lead security detail, a man who had been on his payroll for 5 years, knocked twice before entering. "The perimeter is clear, Mr. De Luca. The car is idling at the gate. We are ready for the 6 o'clock departure." Lorenzo didn't look up as he gathered his things. "Efficiency is the only thing I pay you for," he said, his voice like velvet over gravel. "Ensure the driver has the updated route to the shipyard. I don't want a repeat of last week's traffic delay." "Of course, sir. Everything is handled." Lorenzo checked his watch. 5:50 p.m. 10 minutes until he would step out into the humidity of the evening. He felt a brief flicker of satisfaction at the order of his world. He was the architect of this life, surrounded by men he paid to be loyal and protected by armor-plated glass. He walked toward the heavy oak doors, his footsteps rhythmic and steady, unaware that the very men walking behind him had already traded his life for a payday. He moved with the confidence of a king, never suspecting that his survival didn't depend on his millions or his guards, but on a small girl in a teal hoodie waiting desperately on the curb just beyond his gates. Amara scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The small basket of trinkets swung precariously on her arm as she rushed toward the heavy iron gates. Her breathing was shallow, the air thick with the scent of exhaust and the impending disaster only she could see. She didn't have time to be a ghost anymore. She had to be solid. She had to be loud. 2 men stood like granite pillars flanking the entrance to the driveway. They were dressed in the same sharp black suits as the men inside, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses that reflected the orange glow of the setting sun. As Amara approached, their posture shifted, not with concern but with a cold, practiced irritation. "Excuse me, please, you have to listen," Amara gasped, her voice small against the roar of distant city traffic. She reached out, her fingers trembling toward the sleeve of the nearest guard. Before she could touch him, a large hand shot out, palm flat, stopping her momentum. "Back off, kid," the guard grunted, his voice devoid of any warmth. He didn't even look down at her, his gaze remaining fixed on the horizon as if she were nothing more than a stray gust of wind. "No, you don't understand," Amara cried, her voice rising in a desperate pitch. "The car, I heard them." "Someone is on the phone," they said when he opens the door. "I said move," the second guard interrupted, stepping forward to close the gap. He looked down at her then, his lip curling in a sneer that dismissed her entire existence. "We don't want any of your plastic junk today. Go sell your beads on the next block before I have the police move you along." "It's not the beads." Amara's wide eyes filled with hot, frustrated tears. She tried to dodge around him, to get closer to the luxury sedan where the traitor was still standing, but the guard moved with a speed that terrified her. He grabbed the shoulder of her teal hoodie, spinning her back toward the sidewalk. "Last warning, beggar," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Mr. DeLuca doesn't like clutter on his driveway. You're bothering the help and wasting our time. Get lost." He shoved her back, and Amara stumbled, her sneakers skidding on the pavement. She watched as they turned their backs to her, readjusting their jackets, completely oblivious to the fact that the man they were paid to protect was walking into a grave. She stood on the edge of the curb, small and trembling, realizing that the wall of suits was impenetrable to a girl like her. If she was going to save Lorenzo, she couldn't go through them. She would have to go straight to the man who didn't even know she had a name. While Amara reeled from the shove on the sidewalk, the luxury sedan sat in the driveway like a sleeping predator, gleaming and obsidian. It was a masterpiece of engineering, designed to withstand bullets and debris, yet its greatest vulnerability lay tucked out of sight, clinging to the underside of the chassis directly beneath the driver's seat. There, a small black box pulsed with a rhythmic crimson light, a mechanical heartbeat counting down to Lorenzo's final second. The device was crude but absolute, wired to the door's locking mechanism. The moment the handle was pulled, a signal would bridge the gap, turning the armored sanctuary into a casket of fire and twisted steel. A few yards away, tucked into the recessed archway of the estate's side entrance, the traitorous guard, the man Amara had seen on the phone, leaned against the cold stone. His name was Marcus, and he had served as Lorenzo's shadow for 3 years. He checked his watch, 5:54 p.m. in his right pocket. His fingers brushed the cold plastic of a secondary remote detonator, a backup insurance policy to ensure that if the door sensor failed, the job would still be finished. Marcus watched the wall of suits at the gate with a mask of professional boredom, but internally his pulse was racing with the high-octane thrill of betrayal. He had been paid more for this one afternoon than a decade of loyal service would ever provide. He looked toward the curb and saw the girl in the teal hoodie. She was standing still now, her basket forgotten at her feet, her wide eyes fixed on the car with a look of dawning horror. For a brief, flickering second, their eyes met. Marcus didn't see a witness. He saw a nuisance, a piece of street clutter that was about to be swept away in the blast radius. He offered a thin, cruel smile, then turned his gaze back to the heavy oak doors of the mansion. The shadows of the trees lengthened across the driveway, stretching like reaching fingers toward the car. The silence of the estate felt artificial now, a thin veil stretched over the violent reality hidden beneath the sedan. Marcus adjusted his earpiece, hearing the chatter of the internal team. "The boss is heading down. Get the lead car moving." The trap was set. The predator was waiting. And as the seconds ticked away, the man in the shadows felt no remorse, only the cold anticipation of the explosion that would rewrite the city's hierarchy, starting with the death of the man who thought he was untouchable. The digital clock on the dashboard of the idling sedan flickered to 5:56 p.m. inside the estate. The heavy oak doors finally groaned open, and Lorenzo DeLuca stepped out into the humid evening air. He moved with the effortless grace of a man who owned the ground he walked upon, his dark tailored suit catching the last amber rays of the sun. He was looking at his phone, his thumbs scrolling through data with a detachment that made him seem more like a machine than a man. To him, the next 4 minutes were merely a logistical bridge between his office and his home. On the curb, Amara felt the world begin to blur. The rejection from the guards at the gate had left her stinging. But the sight of Lorenzo, the target, the man about to be erased, snapped her back into a sharp, terrifying focus. She looked at Marcus, the traitor in the shadows, who was now standing straighter, his hand buried deep in his pocket where the detonator lay. She saw the other guards tensing, readying themselves for the boss's departure. No one was looking at the car's underside. No one was looking at her. "One chance," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. Her lungs felt tight, as if the air itself had turned to lead. She looked at her small basket, the source of her mother's hope, and then back at the man in the suit. If she stayed silent, she would go home tonight with a few dollars and a clean conscience, but she would have to live with the sound of the explosion forever. Lorenzo reached the bottom of the stone steps. He was 30 feet from the car. The lead guard at the gate began to swing the heavy iron bars open. Marcus pulled the burner phone from his pocket one last time, his thumb hovering over a button. Amara didn't think about the guards' heavy hands or the police or her own fear anymore. She saw the distance between Lorenzo and the black car shrinking, 20 feet, 15, 10. She saw his hand reach out, beginning the casual, practiced motion of grabbing the door handle. In that heartbeat, Amara lunged. She didn't scream for the guards. She knew they wouldn't listen. She didn't run for the car. She ran straight for the man. Her sneakers slapped against the pavement, a frantic, rhythmic sound that finally broke the silence of the driveway. She was a streak of faded teal against the gray stone, a desperate prayer in motion, moving toward the most dangerous man in the city just as he prepared to trigger his own end. Lorenzo's hand was inches from the handle when the world fractured. He didn't hear the guards shout, and he didn't see the blur of teal until it was already upon him. A small, desperate weight collided with his arm, and suddenly the sleeve of his custom-tailored suit was being bunched in a tiny, trembling fist. "Stop! Don't get in! Don't open the door!" Lorenzo froze, more out of sheer shock than obedience. He looked down to see the girl from the curb, the one he had looked past 100 times. Her curly puff ponytails were messy, her face was flushed, and her wide eyes were swimming with a terror so raw it gave him pause. "Release me, child," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. He didn't like being touched, and he certainly didn't like his schedule being interrupted. He looked to his guards, his eyes flashing with a silent demand for them to remove the nuisance. 2 guards lunged forward to grab her, but Amara didn't let go. She dug her heels into the pavement, her voice cracking as she screamed the words she had overheard in the shadows. "The package is set, under the driver's seat. They said when you open the door, it's over." The air in the driveway seemed to turn to glass. Lorenzo felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. The guards stopped mid-stride, their eyes darting toward the car. In the periphery, Marcus, the man in the shadows, let his hand twitch inside his pocket. "Who told you that?" Lorenzo asked, his voice suddenly very quiet. He reached down not to push her away but to steady her shaking shoulders. "The man by the pillar," Amara pointed a shaking finger toward Marcus. "He was on the phone. He said the device is set. He said you wouldn't even have time to scream." Lorenzo didn't look at the car. He looked directly at Marcus. He saw the way his loyal shadow's face drained of color, the way his jaw tightened, and the way his hand gripped something deep inside his jacket pocket. It was the only confirmation Lorenzo needed. "Get away from the vehicle," Lorenzo commanded, his voice ringing out with a terrifying authority that brooked no argument. He pulled Amara behind him, using his own body as a shield, his eyes never leaving the traitor. At 5:59 p.m., the silence was absolute. The man who lived by the clock realized that if it hadn't been for the small girl currently clutching his hand for dear life, his watch would have stopped forever in exactly 60 seconds. The tension in the driveway snapped like a fraying cable. Lorenz didn't move, his tall frame looming as a literal shield between Amara and the obsidian car. His eyes, usually as cold and unreadable as stone, were now fixed with predatory intensity on Marcus. The traitorous guard stood paralyzed in the shadow of the stone pillar, his thumb still buried in his pocket, hovering over the trigger that had lost its element of surprise. "Check the car," Lorenzo commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl that sent the remaining loyal guards into a frantic blur of motion. 2 men dropped to the pavement, sliding beneath the chassis with tactical flashlights. The beams of light cut through the gloom, reflecting off the polished metal until they hit the small, black box clinging to the frame like a parasite. "He's right, sir," one of the guards shouted, his voice cracking with adrenaline. "It's a remote-detonated explosive, wired to the door lock. If you had pulled that handle—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Lorenzo's grip on Amara's shoulder tightened, not out of aggression, but as a grounding anchor. He turned his gaze back to Marcus, who was now trembling, realizing the empire he had tried to topple was still standing, and it was looking directly at him. "Marcus," Lorenzo said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "take your hand out of your pocket, very slowly." The traitor hesitated, a desperate, wild look in his eyes as he realized his payday had turned into a death warrant. Before he could make a choice, the wall of suits at the gate surged forward. They tackled Marcus to the concrete, pinning him down with a roar of movement. As they wrenched his hand from his jacket, a small plastic detonator clattered onto the stone, sliding to a stop just inches from Lorenzo's expensive leather shoes. The silence that followed was heavier than the explosion would have been. Lorenzo looked down at the device, then back at the little girl in the faded teal hoodie. For the first time in his life, his internal clock was irrelevant. The precision, the schedules, the cold calculations, all of it had been rendered meaningless by the brave, terrified heart of a child he had spent months ignoring. "He was the one," Amara whispered, her voice finally breaking as the adrenaline began to ebb away, replaced by the weight of what she had just done. Lorenzo knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with her. He didn't look like a mafia boss in that moment. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "You saved me," he murmured, the words sounding foreign in his own mouth. He looked at her basket of trinkets, overturned on the pavement, and then at the face of the girl who had been invisible until she chose to be the loudest voice in the world. The revelation wasn't just the bomb or the betrayal. It was the realization that he owed his life to the very person he had considered a variable of no consequence. The following evening, the cramped hallway of the apartment building smelled of pine cleaner and simmering onions, a stark contrast to the sterile, expensive scent of the De Luca estate. Lorenzo De Luca stood before apartment 4B, his presence seemingly too large for the narrow corridor. He had discarded his tie and his sleeves were rolled up, but he still looked like a man who belonged in a boardroom, not a tenement. Behind him, two new guards, men vetted through a grueling midnight interrogation, stood watch at the stairwell, their hands clasped firmly in front of them. Lorenzo hesitated before knocking. He had spent his entire life commanding respect through fear and wealth, yet as he stood at the door of the girl who had saved him, he felt a rare, unsettling humility. The door creaked open, held by a safety chain. Amara's mother, a woman whose eyes bore the same sharp intelligence as her daughter's but were clouded by the weariness of 3 jobs, peered out. Her breath hitched when she saw the man from the news, the one her daughter hadn't stopped talking about since she'd come home shaking and tear-streaked the night before. "Mr. De Luca," she whispered, slowly unlatching the chain. "I'm not here as a businessman," Lorenzo said, his voice softer than it had ever been in his professional life. He stepped into the small living room, where Amara sat at a scarred wooden table, her teal hoodie replaced by a clean t-shirt, working on her homework by the light of a flickering lamp. When she saw him, she stood up, her eyes wide. Lorenzo didn't wait for a greeting. He walked over to her and placed a small, polished wooden box on the table. Inside wasn't jewelry or cash, but a legal deed and a set of keys. "I spent years looking through people like you, Amara," Lorenzo said, looking around the room at the peeling wallpaper and the stacks of unpaid bills he had noticed the moment he walked in. "I thought my world was secure because I had money and power. I was wrong. My world was only secure because you chose to speak when everyone else was silent." He looked at her mother, then back to Amara. "This is a debt of honor. A De Luca never forgets a life-saving favor." He explained that the keys were for a house in a quiet, safe neighborhood, closer to a school that would nurture Amara's brilliant mind. "But more than that," he added, "I want you to know that you are no longer invisible, to me or to this city." Amara looked at the keys, then up at the man who had been a cold giant only 24 hours ago. She saw the change in his eyes. The ice had melted into a profound, quiet respect. For the first time, Lorenzo didn't check his watch. He sat down at the small wooden table, asking Amara about her schoolwork, finally realizing that the most important investment he would ever make wasn't in a company, but in the future of the girl who had given him a second chance to be human. 1 year later, the city's skyline looked the same, but the heart of the DeLuca Empire had been irrevocably altered. Inside a bright, modern classroom at one of the city's most prestigious academies, Amara Johnson sat in the front row, her curly puff ponytails tied with teal ribbons that matched her school blazer. She was no longer a ghost on the sidewalk. She was a top student, a girl whose hand was the first to shoot up when a difficult question was asked. She had traded her basket of trinkets for a backpack full of books, and the wide-eyed fear that had once haunted her had been replaced by the steady glow of confidence. Outside the school gates, a black sedan waited. It wasn't the armored fortress of the past, but a symbol of a new era. When the bell rang and Amara bounded down the steps, she wasn't met by a wall of cold, silent guards. Instead, Lorenzo DeLuca stepped out of the car himself. He still wore his sharp, tailored suits, but the predatory edge in his eyes had softened into a focused, protective warmth. "How was the physics presentation?" Lorenzo asked as she approached. He didn't check his watch. The man who once lived and died by the second had learned that some moments were meant to be stretched, not measured. "I got an A," Amara beamed, sliding into the back seat. "And I told the teacher you'd be at the ceremony next week. You're still coming, right?" "I wouldn't miss it for any board meeting," he replied, and he meant it. Lorenzo's business had changed too. He had redirected the vast resources of his empire away from the shadows and toward the light, funding community centers and youth programs in the very neighborhoods he used to overlook. He had built a legacy of protection, ensuring that other children in teal hoodies wouldn't have to be invisible to survive. He had realized that true power didn't come from the fear you instilled in your enemies, but from the hope you provided to the vulnerable. As they drove through the city, Amara looked out the window at the streets where she used to sell flowers and beads. She saw a girl on a corner, small and overlooked, and she caught Lorenzo's eye in the rearview mirror. He nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. He had once been a man who conquered the city, but thanks to the girl who refused to stay silent, he was finally a man who served it. The old empire had fallen on a Tuesday at 6:00 p.m., but the new one, built on gratitude, humility, and the courage of a 9-year-old witness, was just beginning to rise.